Okay, so this video is just to go over the 3 problems at the very end in case you got stuck or you didn't understand why you got the questions incorrect. So for this first one, 2x squared plus 3x minus 4 is less than or equal to 0. So 2x squared plus 3x minus 4, that's my f of x. I'm looking at where it's less than or equal to 0. So my first step, I'm going to graph it, and I'll use my graphing calculator to find those zeros. So in my y1, I'm going to type in that whole equation, 2x squared plus 3x minus 4, and I'm going to graph it. And then I'm going to calculate the points of intersection. So I'm going to use the calc feature, use 0, and I'll go to the left of my first 0, then to the right, and then hit enter, enter, and I'll get that my first 0 is at 2.351. I'm going to draw just a brief sketch of that parabola first. So it looks something like this. This first 0 is at negative 2.351. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing for this other 0. Second calc, 0. Select a left, point to the left of the 0. Oops, sorry, I messed up. Okay, 0, point to the left, point to the right. And I'll get x equals 0.851. Okay. So now I'm going to draw my number line down at the bottom. I've got 2 values that I care about. So negative 2.351 and 0.851. 2.351 and 0.851. I'm looking at where f of x, or where my y values, are less than or equal to 0. So y is less than 0, that's everywhere underneath my x-axis. And the section of my graph that's in between, or that's in that highlighted section, is in between these 2 values. So I'm going to shade on my number line the values in between. Next I want to ask myself, well, can my y values equal 0? So can y equal 0? Are these 2 points included? And the answer to that is yes, it can equal 0. So these 2 points get closed circles. I'm going to look for my endpoints. So as I go to my left, the solutions start at negative 2.351. And they get a bracket because that's included. And it goes 2.851, which also gets a bracket because it's included. Okay, for number 2, similar setup. I'm looking at where f of x is now greater than or equal to 0. So this is where my y values are greater than or equal to 0. I'm going to graph it. So in this case, I've got x squared plus 3x minus 2. So I'm going to do a rough sketch of my parabola just over on my paper. And next I've got to calculate those zeros. So I'm going to do second calc, 0, find a left bound of the first one, right bound. I'll end up at x equals negative 3.562. So at this value, negative 3.562. And then I'm going to find my other 0. So second calc, 0, go over to the left, to the right, and I'll end up at x equals negative 0.561. 0.561. Okay, so from there, I'm going to draw my number line at the bottom. The values that I care about are negative 3.562 and a 0.561. If I'm looking at where my graph is greater than 0 or where y is greater than 0? Well, y is greater than 0 is everywhere above my x-axis. So I'm going to shade this whole section. Okay. I want to ask myself, am I looking at, is the shaded part the values in between these two? Or is it the values outside? And since it's not in between, this in between section is not shaded, it's going to be the values to the outside of my two solutions. The last question I want to ask myself are these circles open or closed? Since it can equal 0, they're going to be closed circles. Closed circles. So my inequality notation, starting from the left, I'm starting at a negative infinity. Negative infinity always gets parentheses. I go to a negative 3.562, which gets a bracket since it can include 0. Then I've got a union. I'll start up again at 0.561 or 562, and I'm going to a positive infinity. Okay. This last one, before I can start, I need to get 0 on this side, so I've got to subtract 8 from both sides. So that I've got 2x squared minus 3x minus 8 is less than 0. So now I've got my f of x, and I'm looking at where it is less than 0. I'm going to go ahead and graph it. So I'll type in that whole equation into my y1, 2x to the power of 2 minus 3x minus 8. And I'll hit graph. Now I'm going to find the zeros, so second calc, 0, go over to the left, then to the right. And I'll get 1 0 is at negative 1.386. So here's my parabola, negative 1.386. Now I'm going to find the other 0, so the second calc, 0. Go over to my left bound, select a right bound, hit enter again, and I'll get a 0 is 2.886. So I will draw my number line down below. The two values that I care about are negative 1.386 and 2.886. I'm looking at where my inequality or where my y values are less than 0. So I'm going to highlight everything that's below that x-axis. And I want to ask myself, is the shaded part the values in between, or is it the values outside of my two x values? And it's going to be the values in between. So I'm going to shade in between these two values. Lastly, I want to ask myself, can my y values equal 0? So can they be zeros? And in this case, it's no. So these two values get open circles. So my inequality notation, I don't have any solutions until I get to negative 1.386. This value gets parentheses because it cannot equal 0. And then I'm going to 2.886, which also gets parentheses.